There is a country where every empire entered believing it would bring peace, and every empire left in pieces. A land trapped between mountains and war, where children grow up hearing helicopters before they hear music, where peace talks last months, and gunfire survives generations. This is not just a country, it is the graveyard of ambitions. A place where history repeats itself so often, the people no longer call it history, they call it life. This is Afghanistan. And the question the world keeps asking is the same one it has asked for centuries. Why does Afghanistan never find peace? Not the Afghanistan of briefing rooms and satellite maps. Not the Afghanistan of think tank papers or presidential addresses. Not the abstraction that appears on the news between commercials, flickering for 30 seconds before the world moves on. The real Afghanistan. The one that has been burning, slowly, completely, without rest, for longer than most nations have existed. The one where children have grown up knowing only the sound of war, and their children after them, and now their children's children. The one where every foreign army that has ever arrived with certainty has eventually left with something broken inside it that it could never quite name. We have been told for generations that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. It is a phrase repeated so often it has become myth. And like all myths, it contains a truth, but also conceals one. Because the real question, the one this film is prepared to ask, is not whether Afghanistan has destroyed empires. The question is whether Afghanistan merely reveals what was already dying inside them. Whether the mountains and the valleys and the tribes and the dust do not create failure, but simply hold up a mirror to it. Whether every army that has come here carrying the flag of civilization, of ideology, of God, or of strategic interest, was already carrying the seeds of its own defeat long before the first shot was fired. This is not a film about Afghanistan as a victim, nor as a villain. It is a film about a place that has become the world's most honest test, where power, stripped of its rhetoric, stripped of its technology, stripped of everything except its actual intentions, is forced to confront what it truly is. And what it truly is, again and again and again, has not been enough. To understand how we arrived here, at this particular ruin in this particular century, we must go back. Not to 2001. Not to 1979. We must go back further, to the moment when the modern catastrophe of Afghanistan was first assembled piece by people who believed they understood a place they had never truly seen. In 1838, the British Empire was at the height of its confidence. It controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface. Its navy ruled every ocean. Its administrators governed hundreds of millions of people across multiple continents, and they did so with a particular kind of certainty, the certainty of men who had never seriously been wrong, and who had therefore never developed the capacity to imagine being wrong. The Governor-General of India at the time, Lord Auckland, was a cautious man by temperament but an ambitious one by position. He looked north from the jewel of the empire, India, and he saw a problem. The problem had a name: Russia. The Russian Empire was expanding southward, steadily, methodically, absorbing the khanates of Central Asia one by one, pushing toward the warm water ports it had always craved, moving in the direction of Persia, of Afghanistan, of the northern approaches to India. The British called this slow-motion collision of empires the Great Game, a phrase so elegant it almost disguised how many people would eventually die playing it in Afghanistan at this time. There was a ruler named Dost Muhammad Khan. He was not a simple man. He was intelligent, politically astute, and had managed to consolidate power over Kabul in a landscape that had historically resisted consolidation. He had sent diplomatic feelers toward the British, looking for an alliance, for recognition, for weapons, for the acknowledgement that his kingdom existed and deserved to be treated as a partner rather than a buffer. The British refused. They had decided, in their distant offices, that Dost Muhammad was insufficiently loyal, that he might tilt toward Russia, that the safer option, the more controllable option, was to replace him with a previous ruler, Shah Shuja, a man who had already been deposed once by his own people, who lived in exile under British protection, and who had, crucially, already signed a treaty with the East India Company. Shah Shuja was, in the British calculation, manageable. This was the first miscalculation. And it was not a small one. It was the foundational error, the belief that a foreign power could select Afghanistan's ruler, install him at the point of a bayonet, and expect that ruler to be accepted by a population that had not chosen him. It was the belief that legitimacy could be imported, that sovereignty was a product transferable between hands. In the spring of 1839, a British Indian force of roughly 16,000 soldiers, plus an accompanying mass of camp followers, servants, merchants, and family members that swelled the total to perhaps 40,000 people, crossed into Afghanistan. They moved through the Bolan Pass, through Kandahar, northward toward Kabul. The journey was brutal, the heat, the distances, the terrain. Men died of exhaustion and disease before they ever faced an enemy. But they reached Kabul. Das Muhammad fled. Shah Shuja was installed. British officers settled into a kind of colonial routine, hosting races, building a market, conducting the business of empire with the comfortable assumption that the hard part was over. It was not over. What the British had done, without fully understanding it, was trigger something that operates by its own logic in Afghanistan, something that has no precise English word, but which the Pashtun describe through the concept of nong, honor, the obligation to resist occupation, the refusal to accept in one's home territory the dominance of a foreign army. It is not simply pride. It is not simply tribalism. It is a code, written into the culture over centuries of survival, in a landscape where the only guarantee of survival was your own willingness to fight for it. By 1841, the tensions had become unbearable. The British Army, settled into its cantonment outside Kabul, had made itself comfortable in the worst possible way. Its commanders were aging and indecisive. Its fortifications were inadequate. Its leadership, under General Elphinstone, a man so unwell he could barely mount a horse, was paralyzed by disagreement. And surrounding it, in every mountain and every village, was a population that had watched foreign soldiers drinking imported wine and shooting pheasants and had reached a conclusion about what these men truly were. The uprising came in November. It was swift, and it was orchestrated by men who understood the terrain in ways the British never could. Alexander Burnes, the British political officer who had spent years in Afghanistan and had perhaps come closest to actually understanding it, was killed in his own house in the first hours of the rebellion. And then came the retreat. In January 1842, approximately 16,000 people, soldiers and civilians, began walking out of Kabul toward the garrison at Jalalabad, approximately 90 miles to the east. The temperature was well below freezing. The passes were thick with snow. And on every ridge, in every narrow defile, Afghan fighters were waiting. What followed was not a battle. It was a systematic destruction. By the time the column reached the catastrophic bottleneck at Gandamak, only a handful of soldiers remained able to fight. They made their last stand on a small hill, 21 officers and 45 men surrounded. They were offered surrender. They refused. They were killed. One man, Dr. William Britton, reached Jalalabad alive. One man of 16,000. The British had come to Afghanistan with the most powerful army in the world, with the most sophisticated empire in history, with total certainty about what they were doing and why. And they had been almost entirely annihilated. But here is what that sentence conceals, and what this film insists on examining. The British were not destroyed by some mystical Afghan power. They were destroyed by their own decisions, by their choice of the wrong ruler, by their failure to fortify properly, by their inability to read the political temperature of a population they had never bothered to understand, by the arrogance of commanders who could not imagine failure and therefore did not prepare for it. Afghanistan did not defeat the British Empire. The British Empire in Afghanistan defeated itself. The British returned, of course. Empires do not respond to humiliation with humility, they respond with escalation. A punitive expedition burned Kabul's great market, the Char Chatta, before withdrawing. It was a gesture violent, pointless, and deeply revealing. It said, "We cannot hold this place, but we will make it pay for our inability to hold it." Two more Anglo-Afghan wars followed, in 1878 and 1919. Each time, the pattern repeated with a fidelity that should have alarmed everyone watching each time. A military force that was technologically superior arrived with political objectives it had not thought through carefully enough. Each time, the Afghans fought back with a ferocity born not of ideology but of the simple, ancient refusal to be governed by strangers. Each time the foreign power eventually withdrew, claiming some version of victory that the subsequent decades would quietly disprove. By 1919, the British finally conceded Afghan independence. They had spent 80 years fighting for the right to control Afghanistan's foreign policy. They had lost tens of thousands of men. They had spent enormous treasure. And what they had ultimately produced was an Afghanistan that was no more stable, no more controllable, no more friendly to foreign interests than the one they had found in 1839. The lesson was written in blood across 8 decades. Almost no one read it. Between the British departure and the Soviet arrival, Afghanistan existed in a kind of historical parenthesis, a period that is easy to overlook because it contains neither invasion nor disaster, and therefore rarely features in the accounts of those who only pay attention when things are burning. But it matters enormously, because it is in this period, roughly 1919 to 1978, that we see what Afghanistan actually becomes when left, more or less, to itself. And what we see is complicated and instructive and deeply sad. There were kings. There were modernizers. There were men who genuinely believed that Afghanistan could build a functioning state, could educate its population, could construct a national identity strong enough to transcend the tribal, ethnic, and linguistic fractures that ran through the country like fault lines. Amanullah Khan, who came to power after independence in 1919, was the most ambitious of them. He had studied what Ataturk was doing in Turkey. He had visited Europe. He came back convinced that Afghanistan needed to modernize rapidly: education, women's rights, Western dress, a constitutional monarchy. He abolished purdah for the wives of government officials. He opened schools for girls. The tribal and religious leadership responded with furious resistance. By 1929, Amanullah had been forced from power by a rebellion that combined genuine rural conservatism with the manipulation of outside powers who preferred instability at the center to the development of a strong Afghan state. The tension that destroyed Amanullah's reforms has never been resolved. It is still there. It was there in 1979 when the Soviets arrived. It was there in 2001 when the Americans came. It is there now today in a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan where the same arguments about women, about education, about what it means to be Afghan and Muslim and modern, are being relitigated with the same ferocity, the same violence, the same fundamental disagreement about whether Afghanistan belongs to its past or its future. By the time we reach the 1960s and early 1970s, the country is caught between two gravitational forces it cannot escape. On one side, the Soviet Union, which has been building roads, training Afghan army officers, funding the left-wing political factions that are growing in Kabul's universities. On the other, the United States, which is watching the Soviet investment with increasing anxiety, funding its own networks, its own relationships, cultivating its own preferred version of Afghan stability. Afghanistan's rulers try to play both sides. For a time it works. Roads get built. Schools open. Kabul develops a small but genuine middle class, educated women in universities, a cultural life that those who experienced it would remember, for the rest of their lives, with a grief so precise it was almost physical. And then, in 1973, a coup. And in 1978, another coup, more violent, more ideological. And in 1979, the thing that changed everything. The year 1979 deserves to be understood not as a beginning, but as a convergence. By then, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the Afghan Communist Party, had seized power and immediately begun tearing itself apart. Two factions, the Khalq and the Parkham, despised each other with an intimacy available only to people who share the same ideology and therefore cannot forgive each other's deviations from it. The Khalq faction, which controlled the government under Nur Muhammad Taraki and then Hafizullah Amin, was attempting to implement a revolutionary program, land reform, literacy campaigns, the abolition of bride price, at a speed and with a brutality that was creating mass revolt in the countryside. Thousands of people were being arrested. Thousands were being killed. The prisons were full. The villages were burning. The rural population, which had no particular love for the old order but had a very precise and personal objection to being told by young urban ideologues how to organize their families and their land and their religion, was rising in rebellion. The Soviets watched this with mounting horror. They had not wanted this revolution when it came. They had told the Afghan communists to slow down, to be patient, to not antagonize the rural population. The Afghan communists had ignored them. And now the Soviets were watching their most important strategic partner in South Asia dissolve into civil war, with a very real possibility that an anti-communist government, perhaps one friendly to the Americans, perhaps one friendly to Pakistan, perhaps one hostile to the Soviet Muslims across the border in Central Asia, would emerge from the wreckage. The Soviet leadership debated through the autumn of 1979. There were voices of caution. Men who understood that military intervention in Afghanistan carried enormous risks. But the dominant logic was the logic of the Cold War, which was ultimately the logic of dominoes. If Afghanistan falls, what falls next? On the 24th of December 1979, Soviet transport aircraft began landing at Kabul airport. Within days, Soviet ground forces were crossing the border from the north. Hafizullah Amin, the Afghan leader whom the Soviets had come, officially, to support, was killed by Soviet special forces in the first hours of the intervention. A new Afghan leader, Babrak Karmal, was flown in from Moscow to take his place. The Soviets called their intervention a limited contingent. They expected to stabilize the situation within months, perhaps a year. They would help the Afghan government consolidate, train the army, suppress the rebellion, and then withdraw. Limited, controlled, strategic. What they had actually done was step onto a conveyor belt, one that would carry them for the next 9 years, into a war they could neither win nor afford to lose. The resistance to the Soviet occupation, what became known as the Mujahideen, was not a single movement. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it, and also one of the most important things to understand about everything that came after. It was, from the beginning, a fractured coalition of groups with different tribal affiliations, different ethnic identities, different interpretations of Islam, different political objectives, and an absolute minimum of trust between them. What they shared was the land beneath them, the enemy in front of them, and a network of foreign patrons who were, for their own reasons, very eager to help them fight. Pakistan's ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, was the primary conduit for what became the largest covert operation in CIA history. Saudi money flowed in enormous quantities. American weapons, Kalashnikovs at first, and then, crucially, in 1986, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles arrived through the ISI's distribution networks. China contributed. Egypt contributed. And all of these contributions came with conditions, with relationships, with the slow accumulation of obligations and dependencies that would shape Afghan politics for decades. The Americans, in particular, were operating with a clarity of purpose that, in retrospect, was the clarity of people who could see one thing perfectly and nothing else at all. They wanted to bleed the Soviets. That was it. That was the objective. Not a stable Afghanistan. Not a prosperous Afghanistan. Not a democratic Afghanistan. The objective was to make the Soviet occupation so costly, in lives and treasure and international prestige, that the USSR would be fatally weakened. And it worked. By the mid-1980s, Soviet soldiers were dying in ambushes in mountain passes that their commanders could not see from any map. The coffins were coming home. The truth about the war, which Soviet state media was suppressing with increasing difficulty, was leaking out through the families of dead soldiers, through veterans who came home broken and silent, through the slow accumulation of a grief that a totalitarian system could manage but not prevent. The Stinger missiles changed everything. Before them, Soviet helicopter gunships had been nearly invincible, able to hover over Mujahideen positions and destroy them with near impunity. After them, the helicopters had to fly higher, had to change their tactics, had to operate with a caution that fundamentally altered the Soviet ability to project force in the mountains. The war became unwinnable in a new way, not just politically but militarily. Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985 already inclined toward reform, looked at Afghanistan and saw a bleeding wound. He called it his bleeding wound. He began the process that would end in February 1989, when the last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge over the Amu Darya River back into Soviet territory. The world declared victory. In Washington, in Riyadh, in Islamabad, there was something approaching jubilation. The Soviet Union had been broken. The Cold War's tide had turned. The Mujahideen, God's warriors, freedom fighters, brave defenders of their homeland against communist oppression, had triumphed. And then the Americans went home. They simply left. The money stopped. The attention stopped. The strategic interests that had poured billions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into Afghanistan evaporated almost overnight, because the thing it had been directed against no longer existed. What remained was Afghanistan, flooded with weapons, dominated by competing warlords. Its government, the communist government that had survived the Soviet departure, still fighting for its life against the Mujahideen factions, who were now fighting each other with the same ferocity they had directed against the Soviets. The civil war that followed the Soviet withdrawal is perhaps the least discussed chapter of modern Afghan history, outside Afghanistan itself. It lasted from 1989 to 1996, and it was in many ways the most destructive period the country had experienced in the 20th century. Kabul, a city that had survived the British, survived the Soviets, survived everything, was reduced to rubble. Warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who had received more CIA and ISI funding than almost any other Mujahideen commander, shelled the city indiscriminately. Rockets fell on markets, on hospitals, on residential streets. Tens of thousands of civilians died. The population of Kabul, the educated, the professional, the modernizing class that had been slowly building something that resembled a civil society, fled. They went to Pakistan, to Iran, to Europe, to America. They took their skills and their hopes and their memories of what Afghanistan had briefly, flickeringly been, and they scattered them across the world. What was left in the ruins was desperation, and into that desperation came a new force, one that had been assembling quietly in the madrasas of Pakistan, in the refugee camps along the border, in the minds of a generation of young men who had grown up knowing only war and displacement and the particular scalding humiliation of being a refugee. They called themselves the Taliban. The students. The Taliban emerged in 1994 in Kandahar, and their initial appearance was understood by many Afghans, including many who would later suffer terribly under them, as something close to relief. The warlords had been monstrous. The checkpoints on every road, where commanders extorted money from traders and raped civilians with impunity. The constant insecurity. The total absence of anything resembling justice or order. Into this, the Taliban arrived with a brutal simplicity. We will impose order. We will clear the roads. We will stop the rape and the extortion. We will enforce the law. The law they enforced was their interpretation of Sharia. And that interpretation was not ancient. It was not traditional Afghan Islam, which had always been more mystical, more syncretic, more accommodating of local custom than the version the Taliban brought. What the Taliban brought was something that had been developed in the Pakistani madrasas, an ideology shaped by the Deobandi movement, hardened by years of war, infused with Pashtun tribal codes, and profoundly, almost deliberately hostile to the modern world. Girls' schools closed. Women were banned from working, from appearing in public without a male guardian. Music was forbidden. Television was forbidden. The flying of kites was forbidden. Men were required to grow their beards to a specified length. But the roads were clear. The checkpoints were gone. The warlords had fled or submitted. By 1996, the Taliban had taken Kabul. They captured the former communist president, Najibullah, who had been living under UN protection in the capital. They castrated him, dragged him behind a vehicle, and hanged his body from a traffic light in the city center. It was a signal, not just of their brutality, but of their contempt for any authority, international, legal, or diplomatic, that stood between them and their vision of what Afghanistan should be. Pakistan supported the Taliban. Saudi Arabia recognized their government. The United Arab Emirates did the same. And the United States, watching from a careful distance, still not entirely sure what to make of this strange new force, did not oppose them with any particular energy. There was even, briefly, a moment of potential engagement. American oil companies were interested in the possibility of a pipeline through Afghanistan, from the Central Asian energy fields to the Pakistani coast. Meetings were held. Taliban representatives visited the United States. Nothing came of it, partly because the Taliban's treatment of women had become an international embarrassment, partly because there were other complications. One of the complications had a name. Osama bin Laden had arrived in Afghanistan in 1996, after being expelled from Sudan. He had a relationship with the Taliban leadership, particularly with Mullah Omar, the movement's one-eyed reclusive supreme leader, that was grounded in shared ideology, shared experience of the anti-Soviet jihad, and the complex obligations of Pashtunwali hospitality. He was a guest. He was protected. He was also building something in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan and in the training camps that dotted the border with Pakistan, building an organization that had declared war not on a local enemy but on the global order. On America. On the West. On what he called the Crusaders and the Jews. The world barely noticed. Or rather, it noticed and filed it under manageable. A fringe ideologue in a broken country. A nuisance perhaps. A threat to be monitored, managed, contained. Then came September 11, 2001. The morning of September 11 changed the way America perceived Afghanistan. It did not change Afghanistan. This is not a cynical observation. It is simply true. Everything that happened to Afghanistan after that date, the invasion, the occupation, the nation-building project, the surge, the withdrawal, was driven primarily by what America needed from Afghanistan for America. The question of what Afghanistan needed was secondary, and often it was not asked at all. The American response was swift, devastating, and, in its initial phase, effective in the narrowest possible sense. Within weeks of the attacks, U.S. Special Forces were on the ground, working with the Northern Alliance, the Mujahideen factions that had never submitted to the Taliban, and calling in airstrikes that shattered Taliban positions with a precision and ferocity that the Taliban had never encountered. By December 2001, the Taliban had collapsed as a governing force. Kabul had fallen. Kandahar had fallen. Mullah Omar had fled. On a motorbike, reportedly. Osama bin Laden was cornered in the cave complex at Tora Bora, in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. And then he escaped. The escape from Tora Bora is one of those moments, quiet, undramatic in appearance, catastrophic in consequence, that pivot history. American commanders, relying heavily on Pakistani forces and Afghan militias to seal the border, did not commit the U.S. ground troops that might have closed the net completely. Whether this was a strategic error, a resource limitation, or something else has been debated for 2 decades. What is not debated is the outcome. Bin Laden crossed into Pakistan, and the manhunt that should have ended the story became a decade-long pursuit that reshaped the entire architecture of American foreign policy. But in December 2001, this was not yet apparent. What was apparent, what felt in those weeks like genuine victory, was that Afghanistan was free of the Taliban. In Kabul, women removed their burqas. Music played in the streets. Kite sellers returned to the markets. The UN convened a conference in Bonn, Germany, where Afghan political factions, carefully selected, carefully managed, agreed on a transitional arrangement. Hamid Karzai, a Pashtun tribal leader with an impeccable sense of how to present himself to Western audiences, was chosen as the interim leader. The nation-building project began. It began with the best of intentions. And intentions in Afghanistan have a long history of producing catastrophes. The architecture of the post-2001 international project in Afghanistan was enormous. Hundreds of billions of dollars. Multiple NATO allies committed to reconstruction and security. The United Nations. The World Bank. Dozens of NGOs. Government ministries rebuilt from scratch, staffed by a combination of returning diaspora Afghans and international advisors who often knew very little about the country they were meant to be reconstructing. Roads were built. Schools were opened. Health clinics were established. Girls returned to education in numbers that, in some provinces, genuinely transformed the social landscape. There was real progress, real measurable human progress in literacy rates, in child mortality, in life expectancy. This is important to say and important to remember because what came later does not erase it. But underneath the construction, underneath the statistics, something was going wrong in ways that the briefing rooms in Washington and Brussels and Kabul's Green Zone were not designed to detect. The reconstruction project was not building an Afghan state. It was building a foreign-funded simulacrum of a state, one that looked like a state from the outside, that had the correct institutions, the correct elections, the correct constitution, but that was fundamentally dependent on foreign money and foreign soldiers for its survival, and that was being hollowed out from within by the corruption that inevitably accompanies the sudden injection of enormous quantities of money into a system with minimal accountability. The corruption was staggering. American officials knew it was staggering. Afghan officials knew it was staggering. Journalists documented it in meticulous detail. Contracts went to politically connected companies with no capacity to deliver. Aid money vanished into chains of subcontractors, each taking a percentage until the actual project, the road, the school, the clinic, received a fraction of what had been allocated, if it was built at all. Government positions were bought and sold. Police checkpoints became sites of extortion that were barely distinguishable from the Taliban checkpoints they had replaced. And Karzai's government, which needed the support of warlords to maintain its position, and which therefore could not move against warlords even when those warlords were running drug operations, kidnapping civilians, and undermining everything the international community claimed to be building, became something that governed its people not through service or legitimacy but through the management of competing interests, bribes, and threats. The people of Afghanistan saw this clearly. They had no reason not to see it. They lived in it. They experienced government as a source of predation rather than protection. They paid bribes to get their children into school, bribes to use the road, bribes to access justice that was never actually just. They watched their governors build mansions on salaries that could not possibly explain the mansions. They watched their police, trained by American money, equipped by NATO, run protection rackets. And in the villages, in the mountains, in the southern provinces where the international presence was thinnest and the Taliban's roots were deepest, the Taliban were watching too. They were regrouping. They were recruiting. They were building the shadow state, the parallel court system, the tax collection, the local dispute resolution, that would eventually prove more durable than the official one. The Taliban courts were harsh, sometimes brutally harsh, but they were fast and they were relatively incorrupt. And in a country where the official courts required bribes and took years and still often produced unjust outcomes, fast and incorrupt had enormous appeal. By 2006, the Taliban were back. Not in the way they had governed in the 1990s, not in control of cities, not capable of sustained conventional operations, but present. Present in the villages, present in the mountains, present in the minds of a population that was exhausted by the promise of a future that kept not arriving. The fighting intensified. American and NATO casualties climbed. The strategy, which had evolved from a counterterrorism mission to a nation-building mission to a counterinsurgency mission to something that had never been given a completely honest name, shifted and shifted again, always in response to the previous shift's failure, always accompanied by a new framework, new metrics, new commanders promising that this time the approach was correct. In 2009, Barack Obama ordered the surge. 30,000 additional American troops, joining the tens of thousands already there. A renewed counterinsurgency strategy, inspired by the approach that had seemed to work temporarily in Iraq. The idea was to clear areas of Taliban presence, hold them with sufficient force to allow the government to establish itself, and then build the institutions, build the confidence, build the self-sustaining security apparatus that would eventually not need American soldiers. The surge produced tactical successes that were real. Helmand province, which had been almost entirely under Taliban control, was contested again. American and Afghan soldiers died in significant numbers taking and holding ground that had been lost. There were moments in certain districts in certain periods where something that could be called progress was genuinely occurring. And then the clock ran out. The surge was always time-limited. The political will in America, already strained by the financial crisis and the accumulated weight of 2 long wars, was not infinite. The troops began to come home. The areas that had been cleared were not fully held. The institutions that had been built were not fully functional. The army and police that had been trained at enormous cost, equipped with American weapons, paid by American money, were not yet capable of replacing the Americans who had been holding the line. The Taliban waited. They had always been better at waiting than their opponents. Here is a truth that took the United States 20 years and more than $2 trillion to fully confirm, and that the British had discovered in the 19th century, and that the Soviets had confirmed in the 20th. You cannot win a war in Afghanistan if the enemy has a sanctuary. The Taliban's sanctuary was Pakistan. This is the fact at the center of the entire modern catastrophe, the fact that was known from the beginning, discussed endlessly in classified briefings and academic papers and journalistic investigations, and never fully confronted, because fully confronting it would have required doing something about Pakistan, and Pakistan was too important, too nuclear, too strategically positioned to be treated as the adversary it functionally was. The ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service, had helped create the Taliban in the 1990s. It had seen them as a tool of Pakistani strategic influence in Afghanistan, a way of ensuring that whatever government emerged in Kabul would be friendly to Islamabad, would not allow Afghanistan to become a base for Pakistani separatists, would not align with India. This was a rational calculation from a narrow Pakistani strategic perspective. What it produced was the most destabilizing force in the region's modern history. After 2001, the ISI's relationship with the Taliban became the central ambiguity of the entire war. Pakistan officially supported the American effort. Pakistani forces fought al-Qaeda operatives along the border. Pakistani intelligence shared information with the CIA. Pakistan received billions of dollars in American military and economic aid. And simultaneously operating through different branches, different networks, different individuals within the ISI, Pakistan maintained contact with, provided sanctuary to, and in some cases actively supported the Taliban leadership, who ran their operations from the Pakistani city of Quetta with a freedom of movement that simply could not have existed without some level of Pakistani state tolerance. American officials knew this. They said so in private, in cables, in memos. They raged about it in meetings. And then they continued sending the money because the alternative, confronting Pakistan directly, risked something they could not afford: the destabilization of a nuclear state, or the cutting of the supply lines through Pakistan that kept the American war effort in Afghanistan functioning. So the war continued on a foundation of compromise. America paid Pakistan. Pakistan supported the Taliban. The Taliban fought America. American soldiers died. Afghan soldiers died. Afghan civilians died. And the money kept flowing in every direction, sustaining a war that none of the major parties had a genuine interest in ending. This is the machine. This is what war, when it becomes self-sustaining, actually looks like. Not ideology, not strategy, not the clean conflict between good and evil that wars are sold as. A machine. With parts. With funding streams and institutional interests and careers built on continuation. A machine that produces death as its primary output and calls it, with various degrees of sincerity, the pursuit of peace. The Afghan people were not passengers in this machine. They were its fuel. To talk about the Afghan people during these decades without collapsing them into statistics is genuinely difficult. The numbers are so large, the suffering so varied, so prolonged, so distributed across geography and time, that the human mind resists them. It reaches for abstraction because abstraction is bearable in a way that the specific is not. But the specific is what happened. A farmer in Helmand province in 2009, watching American helicopters circle over his poppy fields he grows not because he loves opium but because it is the only crop that can survive the drought, reach the market, and earn enough to feed his children. Hearing the soldiers who come to his village speak through an interpreter in a language he does not know, making promises he has heard before and does not believe, watching them leave and then watching the Taliban return the next night. With their own warnings, their own demands, their own violence if he does not comply. He is not a symbol. He is a man trapped between forces that are not his, in a conflict he did not start, in a history he inherited. A woman in Kabul in 2003 returning to her job as a teacher for the first time in 7 years, walking through streets she barely recognizes, past buildings that are still rubble from the Civil War, feeling something that is not quite hope but is adjacent to it, the sense that the world has changed, that the worst is over, that her daughters will have a future that she was denied. She is not a symbol either. She is a woman who will spend the next 17 years building that future, teaching hundreds of children, watching the city rebuild around her, and then watching it all stop, on a single August day in 2021, when the Taliban drove into Kabul and the government dissolved overnight and the future she had built suddenly contracted to the question of where she could hide her books, how she could get her daughters out, whether she could survive. The stories are in the millions. The girl whose school burned. The boy who joined the army and died in a Taliban ambush in a province whose name his family in Kabul had barely heard of. The doctor who treated wounded soldiers from both sides because that is what doctors do, and who was eventually killed by one side or the other, it didn't matter which. The refugee who made it to Europe and spent years trying to explain to people who had not been there what it felt like to love a country that could not stop destroying itself. These are not background. These are the subject. Everything else, the empires, the strategies, the ideologies, the proxy wars and the drone strikes and the conference tables, these are the context. The people are the subject. And the most important thing to say about the subject is that they endured. And they continue to endure. A suffering that was not of their making and has not been of their choosing. The American withdrawal, announced and delayed and announced again across multiple administrations, finally became an irreversible reality in 2021, when President Biden set August 31st as the deadline for complete American military departure. What followed in the summer of that year was something that should not have surprised anyone who had been paying attention, and that somehow still shocked the world. The Afghan army, 300,000 soldiers on paper, dissolved. Not in a single dramatic collapse but in a cascade. Province after province, city after city, as local commanders made deals with the Taliban, as soldiers who had not been paid in months and whose ammunition was running low and whose air support was disappearing made the calculation that fighting was death and surrender was survival. Kabul fell on August 15, 2021. President Ashraf Ghani fled. He did not make a speech. He did not pass power formally to anyone. He simply left, boarded a helicopter, left the country, and the government he led ceased to exist in a matter of hours. The scenes at Kabul airport in the days that followed are already historical images, already fixed in the collective memory of anyone who saw them. The masses of people pressing against the gates, those who had worked for the international community, those who had served in the government, those who had simply built their lives in the assumption that the future would look more like the present than the past. People running alongside aircraft. People clinging to the outside of military planes as they taxied for takeoff. The specific image of people falling from the sky as a departing military transport climbed is one that belongs in the same category as all the most honest images of war. Not the ones that show heroism or sacrifice. The ones that show what really happens when the powerful leave and the powerless are left behind. 13 American soldiers were killed in a suicide bombing at the airport gate. And thousands of Afghans who had worked with the American project, as translators, as security personnel, as government officials, as civil society workers, were left behind, at the mercy of the movement that had spent 20 years fighting everything they represented. The American mission in Afghanistan had lasted 20 years. It had cost, by various estimates, between $2 and $2.5 trillion. It had involved, at its peak, more than 100,000 American troops. It had been the longest war in American history. The Taliban re-entered Kabul wearing American military uniforms, carrying American weapons, riding in American vehicles. The symbolism was so complete it seemed almost too deliberate. The question that follows, the question that will follow for as long as anyone is honest enough to ask it, is, what went wrong? There are many answers, and almost all of them are partially true, and almost none of them are sufficient by themselves. It went wrong because of the corruption. The corruption that was so endemic, so structural, so woven into every interaction between the Afghan state and its citizens, that no amount of international money or training or institution building could overcome it, because the corruption was not a malfunction of the system, it was the system. It went wrong because of Pakistan, because the Taliban's sanctuary in Quetta and Peshawar was never seriously disrupted, because the supply of fighters and weapons and financing across the border was never stopped, because the strategic calculus that kept American money flowing to Islamabad while Islamabad maintained its relationship with the movement killing American soldiers was never resolved, because it was unresolvable within the constraints that everyone had decided, for various reasons, to accept. It went wrong because of the fundamental mismatch between the speed of American politics and the pace of Afghan history. America needed a success that could be communicated in an election cycle. Afghanistan moved in generations. The time horizons were incompatible. What appeared from Washington as progress after 4 years looked from a village in Kandahar like the latest version of something that had happened before and would end the same way. It went wrong because the Afghan National Army, the institution on which everything ultimately depended, was built in the American image rather than the Afghan reality. It was designed to be an American-style force, dependent on American logistics, American air support, American maintenance of its equipment. When the Americans left and the air support stopped and the spare parts stopped and the contractors who maintained the aircraft went home, the Army did not simply weaken, stopped working, functionally, as a fighting force. It went wrong because of 100 smaller things that compounded into something larger. The wrong commanders at the wrong moments, the wrong strategy applied too briefly to allow it to work, the right insight arrived at too late and funded too little and implemented too inconsistently to matter. But underneath all these specific failures, failures of policy, of intelligence, of strategy, of political will, there is something else. Something that the British discovered and the Soviets confirmed and the Americans relearned. You cannot impose a state. This is the lesson that keeps being forgotten because it is expensive to remember. A state, a functioning legitimate state, one that its citizens accept as having the right to govern them, is not a product that can be delivered. It cannot be designed in a conference room in Bonn or Washington or London, and then assembled on the ground by foreign soldiers and international development organizations. It grows. It grows from specific historical conditions, from specific relationships between people and institutions, from the accumulated experience of communities discovering that cooperation serves them better than conflict, that the rule of law protects them better than the rule of the strongest. Afghanistan had been prevented from having this experience. Over and over across the 19th and 20th centuries, the process of state building, always fragile, always contested, always requiring the long patience of people working through their differences, had been interrupted by British intervention, by proxy war, by the civil war that followed the Soviets, by the Taliban, by the American invasion, by the American occupation, by the American withdrawal. At each moment when something might have consolidated, something arrived from outside to prevent it. And so the question of whether Afghanistan can ever find peace is ultimately not a question about Afghanistan's culture, or its tribalism, or its Islam, or any of the other explanations that have been offered over the years with varying degrees of Orientalist condescension. It is a question about whether the forces that surround Afghanistan, Pakistan and Iran and Russia and China and India and, above all, the global powers that treat the region as a board on which they play their games, will ever have a sufficient common interest in Afghan stability to stop using its instability as a tool. The answer currently is no. The Taliban returned to power in August 2021, and they governed in ways that were both familiar and newly confounding to those who had hoped that 2 decades of interaction with the outside world might have moderated them. Girls' schools above the 6th grade were closed. Women were banned from universities. Women were banned from working for NGOs. Women were eventually banned from appearing in public without a male guardian, and from going to parks and gyms and public baths. Their voices were restricted on radio. The country became, under a set of decrees issued with quiet regularity by a supreme leader who was rarely seen and never photographed, the most gender-restricted society on earth. The international community responded with sanctions, with condemnation, with the freezing of Afghan central bank assets, approximately $9 billion, much of it held in the United States. This money, intended to stabilize whatever government emerged, was frozen as leverage. The leverage produced no change in Taliban behavior. The frozen money produced a banking collapse and a humanitarian crisis of extraordinary proportions, in which the Afghan population, the people who had no vote in any of the decisions that had led to this moment, faced mass starvation, a collapsed healthcare system, and an economy that had contracted so severely that millions of families were selling their possessions, their homes, and in documented cases their children, to survive. The Taliban, it turned out, were better at surviving sanctions than the population they governed. They had practice. They had spent 20 years being sanctioned. They had the poppy crop, Afghanistan's drug production, already the world's largest, reached historic highs under Taliban governance, as the movement that had formally banned opium in its first period in power discovered that taxing it was an enormous source of revenue. Until 2022, when they again announced a ban, which was partially implemented and then quietly relaxed in the face of the economic reality. They had Chinese interest. China had recognized the Taliban government with a speed that reflected its own calculations, a stable Afghanistan that was not a base for Uyghur militants from Xinjiang, that could be integrated into belt and road infrastructure, that could provide access to the mineral wealth that American geological surveys had mapped, rare earth elements, copper, iron, lithium, and that America, having spent decades and trillions of dollars failing to exploit, had left behind. Russia too maintained its relationship with the Taliban, as did Iran, for reasons that were complex and occasionally contradictory but that ultimately came down to the same logic. A Taliban-controlled Afghanistan was manageable in ways that a chaotic, civil war-torn Afghanistan was not. The world, having decided that it could not afford to engage with Afghanistan, settled into a posture of watching from a distance. The humanitarian organizations tried to maintain access, negotiating constantly with Taliban authorities for the right to deliver food and medicine and shelter to a population that desperately needed all three. The journalists who could still get in reported what they found. And what they found consistently was a country that had survived everything but was tired. Profoundly, historically tired. There is a word in Dari, one of Afghanistan's 2 major languages, that is often used by Afghans to describe their experience of their country's history. The word is kismet, fate. Not in the passive, resigned sense that Western audiences sometimes imagine. In the sense of a recognition that certain forces are larger than the individual, that the arc of history is not in your hands, that you can fight and you can endure and you can still be swept away by something that had nothing to do with your choices. But Afghans, the Afghans who have written poetry, who have built cities, who have raised children in the ruins of cities, who have sent their daughters to school when the evidence for that insistence is scarce. These two forces, resignation and resistance, coexist in Afghan culture in a way that outsiders often misread. They see the resignation and conclude that Afghans are passive, that they accept whatever is imposed on them, that they cannot build what is required to build a different future. They miss the resistance, the underground schools, the networks that shelter dissidents, the women who have continued to work in ways that are technically forbidden, the journalists who publish from exile, the young men and women who are already, in 2024 and 2025, thinking about what Afghanistan might become after the Taliban, because after the Taliban they are certain there will be something. There always has been. Here, in the accumulated weight of this history, a question becomes unavoidable. Is there a way out? Not a final answer. This is not that kind of story, but an honest accounting of what a way out might require. It would require first that Pakistan make a different calculation, that the Pakistani military and intelligence establishment genuinely conclude, not in a press release, that a stable, legitimate Afghan state is in Pakistan's interest. This would be a historic reversal of decades of policy, and it is not obviously in the interests of the institutions that would have to make the decision. But without it, the Taliban have their sanctuary, and with their sanctuary, any Afghan government that is not the Taliban or closely aligned with the Taliban faces an adversary it cannot defeat. It would require that the international community, the United States, Europe, China, Russia, develop something that does not currently exist. A common interest in Afghan stability that overrides their competing interests in Afghan instability. This would require a diplomatic architecture of a kind that the current era of great power competition makes nearly impossible to imagine. But without it, Afghanistan remains the board on which the game is played. It would require time. Enormous amounts of time. The building of legitimate institutions that Afghans recognize as their own, that serve them in ways they can feel, is not a decade's work. It is a generation's work, perhaps 2 generations' work. It requires a consistency of support and a patience with slow, unspectacular progress that no democratic government has ever demonstrated with respect to Afghanistan and may, given the nature of democratic politics, be structurally incapable of demonstrating. And it would require, perhaps most fundamentally, the Afghans themselves, all of them, across all the ethnic and tribal and linguistic divisions that have been exploited by foreign powers for 2 centuries, to find a way of talking to each other that does not end in violence. Not because those divisions are not real. Not because the grievances are not legitimate. But because the alternative, the permanent civil war, the permanent poverty, the permanent exploitation by outside powers, is too costly to continue. This is not a small ask. Given the history, it is almost an impossible ask. And yet, there have been moments in Bonn in 2001, in the early years of Reconstruction, in the schools that opened, in the parliament where women sat, in the radio stations that broadcast music and women's voices in political debate, where something that was not peace but was in the direction of peace was briefly, genuinely present. It was fragile. It was dependent on conditions that proved unsustainable. It was undermined by corruption and bad faith, and the refusal of outside powers to make the choices that would have allowed it to survive. But it was real. And its reality matters because it refutes the fatalism that is the other great temptation in telling Afghanistan's story. The fatalism that says this land is cursed, that its people are ungovernable, that war is their nature and destruction their destiny. That is not the story. The story is of a people who have been extraordinarily unlucky in their geography, positioned at the intersection of every major power competition of the last 2 centuries, too strategically valuable to be ignored, too difficult to control, who have been used by the British as a buffer, by the Americans as a Cold War proxy, by Pakistan as a client, by the Soviets as a satellite, by the international community as a project, by the Taliban as a laboratory for a particular vision of the past, and who have endured, who have kept, despite everything, something that cannot quite be named, a sense of themselves, of their land, of their poetry and their music and their hospitality and their mountains, that no army has ever fully extinguished and no government has ever fully possessed. On a hill above Kabul there is a cemetery. It is very old, and it has been added to continuously for as long as anyone can remember. The graves of British officers from the 19th century are there, their Victorian inscriptions worn nearly smooth by the decades. Not far from them, the graves of Afghans who died in ways that the inscriptions, where there are inscriptions, do not fully explain. And newer graves and newer, extending down the hillside in a chronicle of violence that is too long and too detailed and too full of names that the world never learned to read as a single coherent history. It is not the graveyard of empires. It is the graveyard of everyone. Of the empires that came and failed and went home to write about their failure with a certain detachment that comes from having the luxury of going home. And of the Afghans who could not go home because they were already there. When you stand on that hill and look out over Kabul, the ancient city that has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that the rubble of one era is the foundation of the next, you are looking at a place that human beings built and human beings broke and human beings rebuilt again, because that is what human beings do, not because they are invincible, but because the alternative is to stop. The alternative for a people is to cease. And whatever Afghanistan is, and it is many things and not all of them are good, it has not ceased. It has not allowed itself to be erased by any of the forces that have, over the last 2 centuries, attempted to remake it in their image. This is not a happy conclusion. It is not a hopeful one in any comfortable sense. There are girls in Afghanistan today who have never been to school above the 6th grade, who grow up in a country where their humanity is officially partial. There are men in Afghan prisons whose crime was working for the government that the international community spent 20 years building. There are families in refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran and Turkey and Germany and Australia who left because they had to, who dream of a country that may not exist again in their lifetimes. This is the real cost. Not the trillions of dollars. Not the strategic defeats. The cost is measured in the specific futures that did not happen, in the specific lives that were cut short or diminished or exiled, in the specific grief of people who loved a place that could not protect them. If there is a lesson, and history does not always provide lessons, sometimes it only provides evidence, it is perhaps this, that the impulse to control Afghanistan, to use it to make it serve purposes decided elsewhere, has cost everyone who has acted on that impulse dearly, and has cost Afghanistan most of all. That the instinct to intervene, however well-intentioned, without the commitment, the patience, and the genuine subordination of outside interests to Afghan interests that genuine partnership would require, produces not liberation but a longer chain, and that the path to something different, if such a path exists, runs not through the grand strategies of foreign powers but through the specific, patient, unglamorous work of Afghans themselves. Building, arguing, failing, rebuilding generation by generation the possibility of a country that belongs to the people who live in it. No empire has ever been able to give them that. No empire ever will. The mountains have seen all of it. The British columns in their red coats, struggling through the passes with their artillery and their absolute certainty. The Soviet armored columns in their green paint, moving north to south along roads they had themselves built, toward a war they had not imagined. The American helicopters banking against the ridgelines in the golden light of morning, carrying men who had grown up in Ohio and Georgia and California to mountain valleys with no English names. The mountains have seen them all arrive, have watched them establish themselves, fortify their positions, conduct their campaigns with the particular confidence of people who have not yet been here long enough to understand what they are in, have watched the confidence erode slowly then all at once, into something that looked in the end remarkably consistent across all 3 empires. The drawn face, the careful eyes, the knowledge that something has gone wrong in ways that cannot be corrected by more of what was already failing. And have watched them leave. The mountains remain. Below them, in the valleys, in the cities, in the refugee camps across the border, in the diaspora spread across a dozen countries, the Afghan people remain too. They are not waiting to be saved. They tried that. They are not waiting for another foreign army with another theory of how this should work. They know how those stories end. They are waiting, in the way that people wait when they have no alternative, for the conditions that would allow them to save themselves, for the day when the great powers take their game elsewhere, or find a different way of playing it, or simply exhaust themselves into indifference. For the day when Pakistan decides that stability across its border serves it better than instability. For the day when the Taliban encounter a contradiction between their ideology and their survival that forces them to choose, and choose differently than they have chosen before. These are not certain days. Some of them may never come. But in a country where the word for fate and the word for striving have coexisted for centuries, where people have gone on loving this impossible, beautiful, broken place through every invasion and every civil war and every disappointment, the absence of certainty has never been sufficient reason to stop. That, in the end, is what the mountains watch. Not empires. People. Enduring.